Alright darlings, well with everyone back to school now, it's time to start boning up for all those subjects you'll be taking tests on soon. Maths, science, English, and if you feel like throwing your life away you can study for sports sciences as well. But there's one subject that you won't need any book to study for because CBBC has got you covered there with the almighty educational comedy sketch show, Horrible Histories.
Horrible Histories.
You knew this was going to happen eventually. Of course I was going to have to talk about the most successful CBBC show of all time, sans Dick and Dom of course, though that in itself is debatable, but also because I am a massive fan of the Horrible Histories franchise. For those who don't know, Horrible Histories was originally a book series that first started being published in 1990 by Scholastic with measly Middle Ages, which was then followed up in 1993 with the classic Terrible Tudors, which was so successful that over the next few years, 21 more books in the now dubbed Horrible History series were published and became a massive smash hit, selling millions of copies and became one of, if not the most, popular educational book series of all time in Europe. Nearly every school library or county library I've ever been to in my entire life has had a few of these books in their history section, and it's not hard to see why, because they are awesome. They were written by Sunderland Helm author Terry Deary, a man who's made his disagreement with modern school systems very clear, feeling that schools don't really teach relevant life lessons to children, and that history lessons were too neutered and boring to be interesting. So, in retaliation, he decided to make his own book series that gave the facts of history straight to kids, but with all of the blood, gore and gorgeosity left in. So hang on a minute here, he hates school, he loathes teachers, and he loves violence. He's the god to all children. The book series went on to cover just about any major historical period that you would want in a series like this, and even a few lesser known ones too, and each one was blessed with Terry Deary's amazingly sardonic and sadistic sense of humour and straight to the point writing. And to complement it, the books were illustrated by Aussie artist Martin Brown, whose cross between goofy and gritty in his art style perfectly exemplified Deary's writing. These books are a must read and still some of my favourite books of all time, but of course any book series that gets even a little bit of attention has to be franchised, and it didn't take long for that to happen to Horrible Histories. The first attempt to bring HH to a medium other than literature was a cartoon series made in 2001 by an American company known as Mike Young Productions, aka Splash, who have been involved in many TV series. I already covered this series in my first Unintentionally Scary Kids Shows video, but to give a quick recap, it sucked. It wasn't entertaining, the animation was terrible, and most of its facts didn't even come from the books. They just took whatever facts they had and threw them together into a loose narrative. Thankfully the show didn't last very long and it was promptly forgotten about.
Get a grip, lads!
The next attempt to franchise the series came from a comparatively smaller effort. Audiobooks. Kellogg's Cereal teamed up with Deary to make a series of audio adaptations of the books, which were narrated by Deary himself. They made initially 5 CDs based around the most popular eras of the book series, and also Ireland for some reason, and they were pretty entertaining, although they did go a little overboard with the sound effects and music sometimes, and it made them seem a little creepy to listen to at times.
Welcome to the most horrible history lesson ever, or should that be the best ever? Bits of history that your teachers could never tell you, with all the gory bits left in.
But they perfectly captured the funny and educational aspects of the books, using quizzes, stories, audio dramas, and even some songs, and Terry Deary is a fantastic narrator.
When I think of the Tudors, I think of Henry VIII and chopping people's heads off. He lopped off the heads of 2 of his wives for a start. Nice man.
So these CDs were a big part of my childhood as much as the books were, and thankfully you can still find them on YouTube, so if you never got a chance to listen to them, do try and check them out. You'll be surprised how similar they are to the newer TV series. The last attempt to bring this franchise to the mainstream, before the TV series we're about to talk about that is, was through live shows. These happened a few years before the TV series and played throughout various theatres in England between about 2006 and 2008, and I got to see both Terrible Tudors and Awesome Egyptians in Worthing, very thankfully. These shows were actually strikingly similar to the CBBC series that would follow it, using various types of sketches that would involve things like vaudeville, slapstick, puns, songs, and big rehearsed and choreographed sequences. They were also a lot of fun, though once again they really tried to play up the horror elements of the books. And while it was still fun, I don't get why so many versions of Horrible Histories did this. I mean, yes, it does have horror in the name of it, but try to find a balance here. Kids want to have fun when they learn, not be scared. That's what school does to them already. Also, I remember the shows utilising elements that involved real 3D, the same that's used in movies to this day. And bearing in mind, this happened at least a year before they started using it in movies. So it was pretty cool to see, and some of these shows are still running today, though I'm not sure if they're the same shows or more based around the newer TV series, but I recommend seeing them either way. The reason why I bring all this up is that while some of these ventures were a bit hit and miss, they all had elements to them that would come together into the TV series that we're about to talk about. The songs, the sketches, the animation, the allusions to Great British Comedy, all of these elements of the franchise would come together into something that would immortalise it for all time. Eventually, the series got big enough for the BBC to sit up and take notice, which is a big deal if you don't understand that. Getting the attention of companies that have a lot of money to burn, that's not what you want. Getting the attention of companies that don't have a lot of money but are willing to spend it to make a risk on you, that's when you know you've made it. The BBC approached Deary to discuss making a sketch show based on his books, and naturally he agreed. And so the BBC began production on the series. There were other sketch shows on CBBC before this, such as Stupid and Sorry I've Got No Head, both of which ironically starred Marcus Brigstock, but the big problem with them is that they suffered from really lazy writing. You know how the key to any good recurring comedy sketch is having the same setup but a different punchline? Well, CBBC thought the key to any good recurring sketch was having the same setup and the same punchline. Over and over and over again. The sketch shows that CBBC did in the noughties was so tedious and dull and just not funny. Occasionally they would get a sketch that would get a laugh, but then they repeat it with the same set and punchline over and over and over again until it buried into the ground. Stupid was a show that I could tolerate due to the scenes involving King Stupid and Goomba between each sketch. They were always the best bits, but the sketches that bridged these moments were mostly rubbish. But Sorry I've Got No Head? That show was total garbage. I never thought it was entertaining, and this is coming from a guy whose favourite TV show is still one where every episode is basically just throwing muck around for 2 hours. So if you couldn't entertain me back then, you know you suck. So thankfully some bright spark thought, hey, why don't we make a comedy sketch series where the script is bigger than 20 pages, but also base it off of another franchise so we can just steal material from that and we don't have to make it from scratch. And thus, Horrible Histories, the live-action series, was born, premiering on the 16th of April 2009, making this the 10-year anniversary from when it started, though it technically hasn't ended yet, which we'll get into later. This is what made Horrible Histories so great, since nearly every sketch was different, and any of the reoccurring ones had different punchlines. This was due to how they had an entire book series to take ideas from, plus the fact that they were based off of real historical events. And you know what they say, the truth is stranger than fiction, which really shows here.
Here in the 1800s, mummies are being dug up all over the place. But don't throw them away. Make use of them today. Just crush some mummy into a powder, add it to your paint, and watch those nasty cracks disappear. And just look at the results.
By the way, what is the occasion?
Oh, I'm making my dear friend Incitatus a consul.
Well, there's nothing crazy about that.
No, he is my favourite horse.
You join us here on this most sombre of days in the year 1087 as we witness the funeral of our great ruler, William the Conqueror. Oh dear, one of his arms has dropped off there. And now the king's stomach has exploded due to the buildup of gases.
The show has been most chiefly described by critics as a cross between Monty Python and Blackadder, which is pretty accurate as the sketch structure, production style, and even some of the themes of Monty Python are in there, but uses the same sense of historical events being equated to modern day comedy that Blackadder had. But it also reminds me a lot of Laugh-In, with the cheap production values but great writing and acting, and the way they broke up the show with its sketches. And it also reminds me, bizarrely, bizarrely, of spitting image with its use of puppets, modern-day satire, and songs. Though, thankfully, we never got any songs like this.
It's not bloody surprising, mate, 'cause we're a bunch of arrogant bastards who hate black people.
The primary dynamic of the show is that it would have a series of sketches, animations, lessons, quizzes, and at least one song per episode. But instead of showing all of these bits and pieces in rapid fire like most variety shows, they were organised into segments that were themed around a specific historical era, like the Tudors, the Victorians, the Romans, the Egyptians, the Stuarts, etc. So each segment would usually have at least 2 sketches, a quiz, and various other parts in it. This was a brilliant way to do the show because, of course, there's so much material to work with in a show like this, it would have been way too easy to make it too daunting or overbearing for the kids. But by structuring it like this, it not only gave it more stability, but it made it endlessly versatile. The animated series would only focus on one historical period per episode, which meant that all possibilities for each period would be exhausted by the end of the episode, and thus they wouldn't be able to do another episode on the same era. But by spreading the information out like this, and not watering it down at the same time, meant that you could keep using the same historical eras over and over again, but still keep it fresh, and you still have something new each time they went back. It was a genius idea. Some say that history is one of our greatest natural resources, but like any natural resource, there's a finite supply, so by spreading it out like this, it made sure that they would never run out too quickly.
This is the 7 o'clock news. This is the 9 o'clock news. And this is the news at 10. And this is the person that wrote that joke.
This also allowed them to cherry pick the best bits from the books without having to transition them by linking them to other events. For example, in the book version of Terrible Tudors, they would start off by talking about the Tudor monarchs in order. So first it would be Henry VII, and then they would talk about the significance that his rule played in the Tudor era, like how he fixed the British economy by making his wife wear rags, and how he fought off every claim to his throne. And then they would talk about the next ruler, Henry VIII, and then talk about what he did, and so on and so on. It's a great way to structure a book, but for a TV show you've got a lot less time, and you also have to keep the kids' attention so that they won't get bored and switch it over to the other side. So their sketch system allowed them to do bits about whatever they wanted with no narrative restrictions. You want to do a sketch about how fat King Henry VIII was? There's nothing stopping you. Just establish who he was at the beginning of the sketch, and then you're all set up. It's brilliant. Of course, they would have to establish some things, so they would always have a bit of exposition before a sketch, and this formula does make it more of a show that just gives you fun facts rather than a comprehensive document about a full historical era. But let's be honest, whenever you read a history book, you always end up cherry-picking the bits that you find the most memorable, and to be honest, that's kind of what Horrible Histories is all about, and that's really what makes the franchise, but above all, the show, so great. It would have been so easy for this show to have just been a write-off, which I think the BBC, or at least some members of the BBC, felt it was going to be, but you can tell that there was genuine effort put into the show, and part of that was definitely in its advertising. They played ads for this show weeks before it aired, and it really built up the hype perfectly, with a catchy tune, great montage of clips that perfectly exemplified what the show was about, and it just provided the perfect fanfare for the series to entice people to watch it. Partly because every kid in every playground from around the country was singing the song from the ads all day, so it was hard to forget that it was on its way. That being said, Series 1 wasn't the best start. It was still decent, but the jokes weren't very clever, rather predictable, and they really went all out on the gross-out humour, so it felt very little different from other sketch shows on CBBC at the time. But there were moments of inspiration that seeped through the cracks to keep it a bit above the others, mostly from the parts taken directly from the books. Also, the production quality was rather cheap. As you can see, the quality of the cameras they were using weren't as good as the later series. The camera that I was using back then had better quality than these ones. I get the feeling that the BBC thought that Horrible Histories wasn't initially going to succeed, so they gave it the Red Dwarf treatment. The bare minimum of budget and resources, and then they would see if it would succeed from that. And quite thankfully, it did. Part of what made this show so enjoyable was its cast, who you could tell were really trying their damnedest to make the material they were given funny and educational, and I think they pulled it off for the most part. There was the ever-awesome Matthew Banton, who was most famous for playing Charles II, the big man himself, Simon Farnby, who probably played the most varied amount of roles, but did play Caligula and George III most regularly, Lawrence Ricard, who played Bob Hale and was always my favourite member of the cast, Martha Howe-Douglas, who played Queen Elizabeth I and Queen Victoria, Jim Howick, who played George IV, and Ben Wilbond, who played Henry VIII. All these guys did amazing jobs in their roles, though some of their accents needed work, especially their Scottish ones.
We're Scottish, we don't need some prayer book from England. You're not right, you! I'm no happy.
Please! Right, I knew there'd be trouble. Right! Let's just be absolutely clear, shall we? Who's happy to read from the new Church of England prayer book?
Mel Gibson could do a better job than that. Although presumably these guys are a lot more tolerant than him. Series 1 also had a lot of cast members that would eventually leave by Series 2, such as Javon Prince, who went on to star on Channel 4's Phone Shop, and Sarah Hadland, who went on to be in Crap Vicar of Dibley. Yeah, I said it, you know it's true. The loss of Yvonne was a bit sad, since he was quite good, but he didn't really mesh as well with the other cast members, and Sarah's departure was for the better in my opinion, though she did return in Series 4. I guess she needed a paycheck after Miranda ended 3 series too late. After the first series though, they really upped production values and writing quality, and each progressive series has been better than the last. Now, that's not to say they still didn't rely on some cheap and easy kiddie jokes, but it is a kids show for the BBC, they have to put those easy jokes in there. But a majority of the jokes and writing after the first series was much smarter and much more like the books.
You see, these are all the advantages of having the army commanded by a small group of upper-class twits.
I'm not an upper-class twit, sir.
And that's why you're not in charge of anything at all, Nolan. So be quiet!
What am I supposed to buy with a bag of salt? A bag of pepper?
Starring Napoleon Bonaparte as the Emperor of France, the King of Italy, the Protector of the Rhine, and all the other things he called himself.
What? I like titles.
Series 2 also introduced a few new cast members such as Hot Fuzz's Alice Lowe and Larry Lewin, who played Rossiter the Vin Voce in Doctor Who, both of which were far better choices in the cast than Hadland and Prince. They also brought in Dominique Moore, who was a regular at CBBC at the time, and some of the series would even feature cameos from Hollywood-level celebrities like Chris Anderson, Al Murray, and the League of Gentlemen themselves, Steve Pemberton, Reece Shearsmith, and Mark Gatiss. Which is actually quite fitting really, since not only do both series have a very similar sense of humour, but both series have cast members who struggle to find work after the series is over.
Gaius Julius Caesar, dictator of Rome, consort of Cleopatra, and conqueror of Gaul.
Well, in this room, you're just a guy with a big nose and a plant on his head.
But, of course, the best reoccurring cast member was the author of the books themselves, Terry Deary, who I guess kept popping up to make sure that they weren't going to mess up his beloved series like CITV did. Which, thankfully, they didn't, because I regard the CBBC series as the best representation of the books ever. As I said before, the books balance the more gruesome aspects of history with witty humour and light-hearted satire. It made reading about a fat Welsh guy chopping off the heads of his wives, or men in Egypt sticking hooks up dead guys' noses and going brain fishing, seem hilarious and not gruesome at all. At least not in the way that would gross you out, but be more intrigued and entertained by it, which is what you want in a series for kids. But then again, if the primary audience is kids, you don't need to make the gross-out humour subversive to make them laugh. Simply put though, if you want a historical document that gives you all the hard facts in as dark and unsettling way as possible, that's what we have period dramas for. And I would say the History Channel as well, but they're more obsessed with aliens and dull shows about cleaning out someone's shed with really dumb names. But Horrible Histories made learning about these kind of things fun, and the show perfectly captured that. Using bright and colourful sets, locations, props and presentation. They even got Martin Brown to do the illustrations for their animation, which really helped make it feel like the books were actually on the screen. However, the show wasn't just a carbon copy of the books, it gave the information in clever ways with its sketches, using every comedic trick in the book. They did social satire, movie spoofs, songs, puns, fourth wall jokes, background gags, sound effect punctuations, slapstick, any kind of comedy genre you can think of, this show did, and it did it rather well. But you're probably thinking, well, this is a show that's supposed to be educational. Won't the kids get confused about what's factual and what's fictional? Don't worry, Horrible Histories thought of that. In every sketch, when something would happen that is genuinely factual, a sign would pop up indicating that it did really happen, or in some cases a sign saying if something didn't actually happen. You may think that this is them explaining the joke, which usually would ruin it, but I don't think it does that at all, and it keeps things accurate for the kids. Or as the host would say, accurate. Yes, another way that they would keep their kids informed would be having the host of the show, Rattus Rattus, explain why the events of the sketch actually happened in real life. And it also gave some extra facts related to the subject. It was entertaining and educational. It was edutainment. And by that I don't mean games like Number Munchers. As I said before, the show would typically break up its sketches by era, like Terrible Tudors, Vicious Vikings, Vile Victorians, etc. This was a good way of making sure that each segment could have material and jokes that were taken straight from the books, and make the sketches and material more focused and organised. You don't want to get your periods mixed up now, do you? Oh, someone mixed up Romans with my Saxons. But the show did invent a lot of its own humour, both with one-off sketches and some reoccurring sketches. The most famous reoccurring sketch is Stupid Deaths, a title that speaks for itself, which is one of the best sketches, though I do prefer the way they did the sketch in the first series, where Death was the receptionist to the afterlife and had to ask people how they died, which was basic but really funny. From series 2 onward, however, they changed the premise to be more of a spoof of the X Factor, which wasn't a bad idea, but a really derivative one. Making fun of how cruel and egotistical Simon Cowell is like shooting fish in a barrel, and this joke was super dated even by the time Horrible Histories got around to it. Though I suppose in a way that's kind of appropriate, a historical comedy show has jokes that are completely ancient. The sketch was a great microcosm of the series, since some of the most gruesome parts of history are to do with the deaths of people, and having people explain their most gruesome deaths really shows off how harsh history can be. It's both really funny and morbid as an idea, which again perfectly sums up what Horrible Histories is.
I was captured, and well, I was beaten to death. With my own wooden leg.
Other reoccurring sketches were HHTV Sport, which was about ancient forms of sport, the animation sketches, Cliff Whiteley, which is a sketch about how many facts in history have been mixed up over the years, but my favourite is the Bob Hale sketches, where the titular Bob Hale, played by Lawrence Ricard, would give a quick and speedy recap of a particular historical event in the style of a weather forecast, but do it in a way where he was completely animated and over the top, and it was all done in one take.
But the history books tell us that Uncle I didn't want to give up power, so he killed King Tut by bashing him on the head, a little something like that. Yep, that'll do it. Except that didn't do it. No, it turns out the history books got it wrong, and King Tut actually died from an infected broken leg. They completely ignored the threat, accused the king of plotting with the Austrians, and cut his head off. Then they cut his wife's head off. And then, frankly, they just get a little bit carried away.
That's unbelievably impressive, and yes, he is probably reading off an auto cue behind the camera, but it's still up to him to get all the words out coherently and clearly. And take it from me, even when you're reading straight from the script, that's still a challenge. Why do you think it takes me so long to get these videos out every month? These sketches were so good that he even did a few live ones, like on The One Show and at the Diamond Jubilee.
Well, anyway, that's the history of the Thames in a very soggy nutshell. We hope you enjoyed it. A very happy Jubilee to you, ma'am. A very happy birthday to my Nan. And it's back to you, Shan. That is how you say it, isn't it?
Yeah, almost.
It's close enough, it's close enough.
Someday all news will be like that.
Maybe if the news was more like that, I'd be more inclined to watch it, instead of finding out what happened in the world today through Mock the Week. Or at least I would, until some of the new regulars made it a real chore to watch. I'm looking at you, James Acaster. The writing of some of the reoccurring historical figures was also good, and a lot of them felt like they had really fleshed out characterization throughout all of their appearances, like how Henry VIII is portrayed as a spoilt, violent, gorging, oversized brat, or how Charles II is like a stereotypical partying frat boy due to his role in the Restoration and his infamous womanizing, or my personal favourite, how Caligula is portrayed as a barely stable madman and makes no sense. Admittedly, like I said before, not as good as Malcolm McDowell's portrayal of the character, but in this show, it's fine. It is a kids' show after all, so we can't have a scene where Caligula guts a man to get back the wine he stole from him, do we? The last thing we want to promote is alcoholism. Then of course there's the other thing that Horrible Histories is famous for, its songs. And I have to be honest, the first series didn't really have a good selection of songs, and the reason for that is that most of them were ripped straight from the books. but they weren't really made to be sung. They were more like written poems, so it sounded like a mix between a William Shatner spoken word song and an Allen Ginsberg beat poem when it was in the show, but with less anal and cocaine involved. Again, like with most things in the show, it improved by series 2, as they started being more spoofs of famous rock and pop songs, and while it was still a bit hit and miss, they were at least a bit more catchier and easier to listen to.
I became a highwayman, was daylight robbery. I was no Prince Charming, nothing dandy about me.
Some of them were so popular that Horrible Histories even did a special at the BBC London Proms in 2011, where they performed some of the best songs and even did a few new sketches. One of my favourites being about Mozart and Beethoven meeting each other.
I'm Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, the greatest composer that has ever lived.
My name is Ludwig van Beethoven. I am the greatest composer that ever lived.
Well, I composed over 600 pieces of music. Operas, duets, trios, quartets, quintets, concertos and symphonies, and all before I was 36.
I composed half my music when I was deaf.
Shall we call it a draw?
I think Beethoven forgot about the biggest boast he could give though. That he provided the soundtrack to A Clockwork Orange. Also, like I said before, I can't understate how great the cast is. They really gave it their all, and have a great range with their comedic acting. Hell, Simon Farmby did so well from the show that he went on to write the script for Paddington 2, as well as making a cameo in both Paddington movies, and even made a cameo in Christopher Robin, so he's certainly done well from his time in Horrible Histories. All of this made a show that was widely successful, even more so than the book series. It's still regarded as the most popular and highest grossing CBBC show ever, and I'm not surprised. Dick and Dom might have gone far, but HH went even further than ever before, and it all goes to prove, as I said earlier, the truth is stranger than fiction. The show's original run lasted 5 series, and each one getting better and better, and each one adding new eras to do sketches about, like the Incas, the Aztecs, the Renaissance, and even the 20th century. And the show came to its last hurrah in 2013, but it wasn't quite the end overall. Midway through the original series run, they created a spin-off called Gory Games, a game show with challenges based around real historical events. I'm afraid we already have Nightmare for that.
Ooh, nasty.
The show was hosted by Rattus and Dave Lamb, who many of you might know from Come Dine With Me as the narrator. The show was quite good, especially since the BBC has done great game shows very well in the past, but compared to game shows from previously in the decade, like 50-50 and Get Your Own Back, this one felt a little lackluster. Though it did last for 5 seasons also, and was a great way to expand the franchise in a new and innovative way. About a year after the original series ended, most of the cast and crew went on to the Sky Channel exclusive Yonderland, a series that was designed to be a spoof of fantasy movies and shows like The Dark Crystal and Lord of the Rings. And it was also aimed to be a bit more adult-oriented. I watched a few episodes, and while it wasn't anything amazing, it certainly was funny and contained a lot of the charm that Horrible Histories had. Sadly though, like many of its best shows, the BBC couldn't quite let it go, and in 2015 they revised Horrible Histories for a new season, and with all new cast and crew. A few people from the previous series would return, but all the charm and entertaining elements from the previous series has been washed away. You could tell that they weren't doing this for the purpose of making a great and entertaining show anymore, they were just doing it for the money. And while that is slightly more justifiable since it's the BBC and they always need money, especially when TV license purchases are dropping faster than executors' acts, this really feels cheap and insulting to the franchise. Though I will admit, Rowan Atkinson as Henry VIII was a nice touch. Now we're bringing the fact that we're ripping off Blackadder right into the foreground. But now, sadly, the attempts to bleed the franchise dry for all it's worth has come to a head with the Horrible Histories movie that came out earlier this year, which I personally refuse to watch since I feel that this is the true epitome of pointlessly overextending this previously simple and humble book series into something that it's really not. Horrible Histories' biggest strength has always been from its rustic, homespun charm. Even during the height of the TV series, it was always still there. But now with all these spin-offs, revivals, and now this big budget A-lister movie, which is clearly being made to try and start a new movie franchise. Yeah, watch out Marvel, it's time for the Horrible Histories expanded universe now. It's just too much, and I'm sure Terry Deary is over the moon with how far his franchise has come, and if so, good for him. Many of us can only dream of making it this far in life. But me personally, I feel that this wasn't needed, especially since the movie just looks awful. It really says a lot when a TV show that was made with a minimal budget looks funnier and better than a movie that likely cost over $1 million to make. As a quick side note though, I re-listened to all the old audiobooks leading up to the research of this video, and I was amazed by how humble, quaint and simple they were compared to where the franchise is now. And the biggest shame of it all is that we technically already have a Horrible Histories movie with Bill, which is their interpretation of the early days of William Shakespeare, and it's not that bad. It's not a brilliant movie by any means, but a fun one. But now we've got this piece of crap coming out, and sadly it looks like it's going to be more successful than Bill was, which is really depressing. But even with that disappointment, Horrible Histories as a whole is a glorious franchise, and while I don't agree with the direction it's gone in recent years, the journey as a whole is truly an inspirational one, from starting from just a humble little book series in school libraries to a multi-million empire that spans all over the media world, and now everyone knows its name. Ironically, a bit like the Roman Empire, but while I am a bit burnt out with where this franchise has gone in recent years, I still love Horrible Histories as a whole. It's brought a level to historical teachings that no teacher or textbook has ever done before, and I only hope it returns to its more humble roots some point in the future. But for now, I've had enough of this. I'm going on the other side to have a bath. Bye!
Terrible Tudors, gorgeous Georgians, slimy Stuarts, more Victorian, woeful wars, ferocious fights, stingy castles, daring knights, horrors that defy description, cutthroat council, bull Egyptian, vicious Vikings, cruel crime, punishment from ancient times, Roman rotten, rank and ruthless, cavemen, savage, fierce and toothless, groovy Greeks, brainy sages, mean and middling Middle Ages, gory stories.